They could make out ragged lightning flashes in the distance, a squall approaching in the darkness. The gun barrels and radio antennas on the PT boats crackled with blue sparks and streamers of static electricity. And St. Elmo's fire also appeared just before the rain. Then there was another flash of lightning, and all of a sudden, PT 491 Executive Officer Lieutenant J.G. Terry Chambers saw them, a column of 7 Japanese destroyers moving in the dark toward the U.S., waiting in the Surigao Strait, Fleet 7. On the very early morning of October 25, 1944, 2 Imperial Japanese Navy battleships and a heavy cruiser were speeding toward the final clash between battleships of the line, in what would turn out to be one of the most lopsided confrontations in naval history. A significant part of the historic Battle of Leyte Gulf, the biggest and final major naval conflict in history, which involved the use of all naval warfare modalities save mines, was the Battle of Surigao Strait. On July 27, 1944, the United States decided to launch their next attack against the Philippines rather than Formosa, which sparked the Leyte Gulf conflict. The promise made by General Douglas MacArthur to return to the Philippines will be fulfilled. In order to establish air and sea bases for the subsequent phases, the capture of Mindoro and the final attack on the main island of Luzon, the invasion of the island of Leyte was the first goal. Under the codename King II, 2 U.S. fleets, the 3rd, commanded by Vice Admiral William F. Halsey, Jr., and the 7th, commanded by Vice Admiral Thomas Casson Kincaid, would invade Leyte. Sho-1, Imperial Navy Retaliation. With 9 fleet carriers, 8 light carriers, and 6 fast battleships at its core, the 3rd Fleet served as the invasion's attacking arm. With more than 100 transports and other vessels, including the British mine layer H.M. Ariadne, the 7th Fleet was the amphibious force. It was defended by a swarm of cruisers, destroyers, and escort carriers for close air support, and it was backed by 6 old battleships that were designed for shore bombardment. The fire support force was led by Rear Admiral Jesse B. Oldendorf, who flew his flag in the heavy cruiser USS Louisville. The invasion was scheduled for October 20th, 1944. When the entire American Armada arrived at the opening of the Gulf of Leyte on October 17th, the Japanese finally saw the invaders. Admiral Somu Toyoda, the commander of the Imperial Japanese Navy, then gave the order to launch their meticulously prepared response, Victory Operation 1, or Sho-1. In preparation for America's next offensive maneuver, the Japanese had devised 4 plans, including Sho-1. All of these plans called for the same outcome: the Imperial Japanese Navy's whole might charging forward to assault and destroy the U.S. fleet, regardless of the costs to themselves. Sho-1's strategy was similar to that of the majority of Imperial Japanese Navy plans during World War II. A decoy force would entice the Americans in one way, while a complex sequence of synchronized moves would deliver the main punch from other directions. Under Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa, Japan's remaining aircraft carriers steaming down from the home islands served as the decoy force this time. The Japanese thought the aggressive Halsey would hurry after them with his entire 3rd Fleet, even though these carriers had little offensive power, just 100 planes between them. The Imperial Navy's strong battleships and heavy cruisers, which were mostly stationed at Linga Roads near Singapore and the Borneo fuel stores, would attack from the east and decimate the amphibious forces of the 7th Fleet as they lay in the Leyte Gulf while Halsey was being brought off. In order to isolate the American invaders on land, the surface ships would relentlessly bombard the 7th Fleet with torpedoes and munitions. A shattered navy in the Pacific and an army besieged in the Philippines could at least buy Japan some time, or even convince America to make peace. The Kurita and Nishimura task forces. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita led the battle wagons at Linga, which were made up of a formidable force. They were commanded by the Yamato and Musashi, 2 enormous dreadnoughts that carried 18.1-inch cannons, the largest weaponry ever placed on a battleship. 5 other dreadnoughts and a screen of cruisers and destroyers backed them up, all of which were armed with the fabled Type 95 Long Lance torpedo, which is among the greatest in the world. Despite being worn down by a hard war, the Imperial Japanese Navy was still a formidable force, with leaders and sailors who were highly adept and trained in night combat. Toyota and Kurita organized their battleships to launch a pincer attack on the Leyte Gulf. To attack the Leyte Gulf from the north, Kurita would lead a single force of 5 battleships, among them Yamato and Musashi, through the San Bernardino Strait. Just before daybreak, a second force led by seasoned sea dog, Vice Admiral Shoji Nishimura, would steam through the Surigao Strait and crash into the Leyte Gulf from the south, the anvil to Kurita's hammer. Nishimura, a 1911 graduate of Naval War College, had led destroyers in the 1941 invasion of the Dutch East Indies and the Philippines. In the previous invasion, his son, naval aviator Teiji Nishimura, had been slain. In 1942, Nishimura led cruisers in the arduous battle for Guadalcanal. Despite some misfortune, he demonstrated astute strategy and lion-like fury in combat. Nishimura assumed command of Battleship Division 2, which included the dreadnoughts Fuji and Yamashiro, along with their destroyer escorts on September 10, 1944. Known throughout the Navy for their huge pagoda masts, which rose 44 meters above the waterline, and for spending the most of the war in home waters, primarily as training boats, the 2 battle wagons, sister ships, were built in 1911. The brother of the Emperor had been on Fuso twice. The guns of these battleships had never been fired in rage. The most potent dreadnoughts in the world at the time, they were the first battleships constructed with Japanese engines and weapons. However, by 1944's standards, Fuso and Yamashiro, each equipped with 6 14-inch guns, were slow and antiquated. With crews of roughly 1,600 officers and men, they were sister ships, not twins, and were considered the ugliest ships in the Imperial Navy. Yamashiro had flown Nishimura's flag. 4 destroyers, the Michishio, Yamagumo, Asagumo, and Shigura, as well as the seasoned heavy cruiser, the Mogami, would assist Nishimura's force. Coordination with the 2nd Striking Force was ineffective. Toyota added a 2nd task force to the southern wing, led by Vice Admiral Kiyohide Shima, who would swing down from the Pescador Islands off Formosa. Toyota did not believe Nishimura had enough punch, according to his war charts. The light cruiser Abukuma, which had escorted Japan's carriers to Pearl Harbor, the heavy cruisers Nachi and Ashira, all veteran vessels, and 4 destroyers, Shiranuhi, Kasumi, Ushio, and Akabono, would make up the 2nd attacking force. Shima was a desk sailor, in contrast to Nishimura. Shima had graduated in the class of 1911 from the Naval War College. Just as Nishimura, he had worked in communications at several shore posts. There were no orders for either force commander to coordinate his movements with the other. Neither commander received a thorough briefing on the other's activities. According to historians, Nishimura's battleships were supposed to clear a route so that the cruisers and destroyers in the rear could use torpedoes to attack the transports. Shima's group was to be known as the 2nd Striking Force, and Nishimura's was to be known as the 3rd Section. The Japanese began their complex counter-moves as the Americans advanced on Leyte. In order to refuel in Brunei, Ozawa left Japan, Shima from the Pescadores, and Kurita and Nishimura from Linga Roads. The Americans launched a huge invasion on Leyte on October 20th. The landing started at 10 a.m., and 4 hours later, General MacArthur made his well-known, "I have returned," statement as he stepped solemnly ashore. Speech from the invasion beach while it was raining steadily. In the Sulu Sea, scene. On his flagship, the heavy cruiser Atogo, Kurita called a conference of his senior officers the following day. Kurita gave the assembled admirals an explanation of his plans, which included deciding to split off Nishimura's force and proceed toward the Surigao Strait. Just before dawn on October 25th, the 2 forces would crash into the American 7th Fleet if the intricate ship maneuvers were successful. The following morning, Kurita and his 5 dreadnoughts steamed north to the Sibuyan Sea and the San Bernardino Strait, marking the final departure of the Imperial Japanese Navy's battle line. Nishimura's ships sailed at 3:30 p.m. Shima's vessels were already on their way. the two troops continued to steam into the Sulu Sea without any problems throughout the afternoon and night. When two American submarines detected Kurida's fleet, they launched torpedoes into 3 of his cruisers, sinking 2 of them, including his flagship Atago, and injuring the 3rd. Kurida changed his flag to the Yamato battleship and continued to sail. The new USS Franklin and the veteran USS Enterprise, the carriers closest to Nishimura, launched reconnaissance planes at 6 a.m. on the morning of October 24th to search for Japanese warships in the Sulu Sea. An Enterprise search crew led by Lieutenant Raymond E. Moore detected and accurately identified Nishimura's battleships at 8:30 a.m. 12 bombers and 16 fighters made up the strike force that was en route to the dreadnoughts. The sight of the enormous battleships below was something you dream about as a dive bomber pilot, according to Enterprise Ensign Robert J. Barnes. The fire from the anti-aircraft was excellent. The Japanese ship's 14-inch guns loaded Type 3 anti-aircraft ammunition and fired, as everyone was called, to battle positions by signal halyards and bugle calls. Tokichi Ishii, a Sagumo's chief engineer, was shaken in his engine room by the shelling, surrounded by main battery powder canisters on Fuso, Yoman. Second-class Hideo Ogawa thought that he would meet a swift end if the battleship were struck while he was in the powder storage. After swooping down on the Japanese warships, the American aircraft bombarded, strafed, and fired rockets at them. 20 men were killed by strafing on Yamashiro. A bomb struck Fuso directly, bouncing the first turret on its barbette. Everyone in the secondary battery was killed when it smashed through the deck. A second bomb struck Fuso's quarterdeck, destroying the wardroom and igniting 2 float planes. The Shigur's No. 1 turret was lightly damaged by another bomb. The commander of Enterprise's fighter squadron, Lieutenant Commander Fred Bakutis, had to ditch after being shot out of the sky during the combat. Dehydrated, hungry, burned, but generally in decent condition, he lasted 7 days in a life raft before being discovered and taken by the USS Hardhead submarine. Fortunately, the Japanese failed to detect him. He healed enough to fly again. While the Japanese ship's damage control teams worked, the American jets took off. Both battle wagons sustained moderate damage and ruptured seams. Nishimura gave the order for his ships to continue their mission. To see how the adversary was doing, he launched Mogami scout planes. In the Leyte Gulf, one of them reported a near approximation of the defense. 80 transports, 15 aircraft carriers, 14 PT boats, 2 cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 4 battleships. Nishimura changed his battle plan at 4 p.m., when all ships would charge up the Surigao Strait after Mogami and the 4 destroyers steamed ahead and swept up the enemy PT boats before reassembling. Oldendorf's benefits and drawbacks. Aware of Nishimura's approach, the Americans prepared in the meantime. Rear Admiral Jesse C. Oldendorf, a member of the Annapolis class of 1909, was a muscular Californian. Before the war, he had commanded the heavy cruiser USS Houston, which had escorted President Franklin D. Roosevelt on his travels. His friends called him Oli. He oversaw the screening of large vessels on convoy duty and countermeasures against U-boats in the Caribbean in 1942 and 1943. In 1944, he flew his flag aboard the heavy cruiser USS Louisville and assumed command of the Pacific Fleet's gunfire support battleships. Oldendorf skillfully prepared his defenses with short notice. Early in the evening, he called his subordinate admirals aboard his flagship to discuss his preparations. Large numbers of ships, advanced fire control radar, combat information centers to direct orders and information flow in, and most importantly, the Surigao Strait's narrow terrain, which provided ambush opportunities, were some of his advantages. He put the Japanese through a gauntlet. The first line of defense would be PT boats, which would notify Oldendorf of the enemy's position, size, and movements. Oldendorf would then harass them with torpedo-equipped destroyers. By the time the Japanese arrived at his battle line, which consisted of 10 cruisers, including Australia's HMAS Shropshire, and 6 older battle wagons, they would be exhausted. The congested Surigao Strait would allow Oldendorf to establish a combat line that would hammer the Japanese ships by crossing the T of the Japanese advance, which is every naval commander's desire. However, the U.S., up until now, the Navy had a poor record of winning battles or taking significant losses in nighttime naval engagements in the Solomons. He had no spare torpedoes for his destroyers. The American battleships were older, slower ships constructed shortly after World War I, and at least two of them lacked contemporary radar. They were not the Navy's first fleet of swift dreadnoughts. The primary purpose of Oldendorf's ship's ammo scales was to supply ground troops with support fire. For days they had been doing this. Only 20% of the ammunition was left in some of the destroyers. The battleships had been on the bombardment line for days, firing off 58% of their ammunition. They were outfitted with 77% bombardment shells for ground targets and 23% armor-piercing ordnance for enemy ships. Oldendorf instructed his battleship crew to employ high-explosive ordnance once the Japanese had closed to 17,000 to 20,000 yards, then use armor-piercing shells to tear open the enemy hulls. Oldendorf was more cautious. He instructed his ships to put their seaplanes in hangars and rely on PT boats, radar, and effective communications to monitor the enemy, recalling that Japanese shells had blasted American cruisers' seaplanes to ignite fires at Savo Island in 1942. To reduce the possibility of friendly fire, the cruisers and destroyers positioned themselves on the left and right wings of the combat line. Oldendorf's ships continued to receive more ammunition during the afternoon. PT boats established communication. The American force as a whole was ready for combat. The crews of 5 of the battleships in Oldendorf's line, Maryland, Pennsylvania, West Virginia, California, and Tennessee, were keen to exact revenge for their presence at Pearl Harbor. Phoenix had bravely steamed out of the carnage of Pearl Harbor. Portland had been at Midway. Minneapolis had been at Guadalcanal. And Boise had survived overwhelming Japanese power in the defeats in the Philippines and Dutch East Indies. The 6th battleship was the veteran USS Mississippi. Some of the American cruisers were new warships, such as Denver, Columbia, and Cleveland, while others had long combat histories. Having served on board and survived the sinking of HMAS Canberra before she could fire a shot, the Australians on board HMAS Shropshire had a sour memory of the disaster at Savo Island. Destroyer Squadron, Des Ron, 54, a recent addition to Oldendorf's force, was commanded by Guadalcanal veteran Captain Jesse G. Coward, who gestured to his superior. "If there is surface contact to the southward, I intend to launch an immediate torpedo attack and then withdraw to clear you." 15 minutes later, Oldendorf gave the aggressive Coward the all-clear. "With your approval, I will submit plans shortly." And the Japanese were entering. At 4 in the morning, Nishimura planned to strike the American transports. As the two troops advanced independently across the Mindanao Sea and toward the island of Leyte, Japanese lookouts peered into the darkness as the night grew darker. 39 PT boats in 13 groups of 3 were waiting in the dark for Nishimura's split force. Their engines were running, and they were prepared to fire torpedoes and start their main engines in order to escape. The sea was flat. There was no breeze, and visibility was limited to 3 miles. Only 2 ships were visible to Oldendorf in front of and behind him while he was on board Louisville. Ensign Peter R. Gadd's PT-131 detected the Japanese force on its radar at 10:36 p.m. Other PT boats joined Gadd as he throttled up and closed in to assault. They were astounded to see the massive bulks of Nishimura's capital ships sailing north. Lookouts on Shigure saw the American vessels as the PT boats approached with loose torpedoes. Shigure opened fire and were lighted with star shells. When the PT boats realized they were up against a force far stronger than themselves, they retreated, obscuring their exits with smoke. The battleships added their secondary weapons to the mix. The front torpedo in the PT-130's rack was struck by a single 6-inch shell, which splintered the deck and smashed the nose. The shell went out of the bow of the PT boat without detonating, but it did take out the radio. An hour and a half after the Japanese were discovered, Oldendorf received the reports from the PT boats, who reported their contact up the line of command. The PTs keep harassing people. The PT boats, which resembled terriers, continued to communicate with the Japanese army as it advanced. Two PT vessels attempted to hit Nishimura's ships with torpedoes but were unsuccessful. The brawl strained Japanese nerves, but neither team scored any hits. Because of the declining visibility, Nishimura feared that Mogami would mistake him for the enemy. As expected, Fuso lookouts spotted a suspicious silhouette off the port bow at 1:05 a.m. They described the silhouette as American because they were trained to identify enemy ships, but not Japanese ones. When the battleship fired 6-inch rounds in that direction, the voice radio said angrily, "Cease firing! Cease firing! Ships that are friendly?" It was Mogami. Regretfully, 3 sailors who were laying in sickbay after being injured in the morning's American airstrike were killed when another 6-inch shell struck the cruiser just as the message was being transmitted. Following Nishimura's command for his ships to stop firing, the entire Japanese formation reorganized and started moving north, with Mogami trailing behind and the battleships leading. With unclear intentions, Shima's cruisers trailed some distance behind them. Shima only intended to follow along. He had no intention of working with Nishimura. However, the Japanese were still being harassed by the American PT boats. Then, under the command of Lieutenant Edmund F. Wacklin, PT-134 approached Nishimura's ships within 2,500 yards before being hit by Japanese searchlights and gunfire. Torpedoes launched by Wacklin against Fuso went harmlessly astern of the battleship. Nishimura had to use some clever movement to dodge the American fish as 3 additional PT boats appeared. PT-490 was struck by 2 shells after finding itself 400 yards from the Japanese ships. After sunrise, PT-491 moved in to evacuate the crew, and the injured PT-493 drifted free and sank after further shells struck it, disabling the engine and tearing a hole in the boat's bottom. 3 Americans were killed and 20 injured on the flimsy PT boats. Nishimura put his ships in battle line for the rush up the strait at 2:11 in the morning. Another group of PT boats rushed in from the southeast as they were doing this, firing 6 torpedoes into the Japanese. All of the torpedoes missed. At 20 knots, Nishimura's ships continued to steam. Excellently designed and executed. Then Captain Coward's Desron, 54, appeared. The men on top were only relieved by the wind created by the speed of the tin cans because the sea was glassy and the temperature was around 80 degrees Fahrenheit. After midnight, coffee and sandwiches were delivered to all employees. Coward's 5 destroyers used their radar to map the Japanese approach as they moved south through the strait in 2 flanking groups. Shigure used a searchlight to light up Coward's eastern group at 2:58 in the morning. Coward then allocated targets while his tin cans were cranked up to 30 knots for an attack. He intended to just employ torpedoes in order to avoid using gun flashes to reveal the whereabouts of his ships. The American warships fired 27 torpedoes against the Japanese at 1,100 yards at 3 in the morning. For the first time in her life, Fuso fired her 14-inch guns at a surface target as the torpedoes roared through the sea. At 3:07, Fusilier began firing at her targets after Petty Officer Hideo Ogawa placed cordite charges onto the powder cage elevator from flash-proof storage canisters. The American destroyers were hit by Japanese munitions. 2 American torpedoes from Melvin struck Fuso's starboard side a minute later, causing massive explosions and water sloshing. Slowing, the dreadnought started listing to starboard. The boiler rooms on the starboard quickly flooded. With her starboard side ablaze, the dreadnought sheared out of line. Unbelievably, her colleagues continued to steam north as her skipper, Rear Admiral Masami Ban, failed to radio a damage report. It's possible that he was too busy to do so, or was dealing with too many issues at once. Mogami moved into the position that Fuso had left. Unaware that he had just lost half of his dreadnought strength, Nishimura continued to radio commands to a Fuso who was not responding. Illuminated by a Japanese parachute flare from one of Yamashiro's float planes, Coward's destroyers surged in. "It is about time for something to happen," said Chief Petty Officer Virgil Rawlins, who was riding McDermott's No. 2 torpedo mount, calmly as their torpedoes raced out. The darkness was suddenly illuminated by fireballs and explosions about 3:20 a.m. The destroyer instantly exploded after 2 torpedoes struck Yamagumo's port side. The explosion could be seen as far away as Oldendorf's battleships. The destroyer sank quickly after the hits reportedly cooked off Yamagumo's torpedoes. The devastation was just getting started. A torpedo struck Yamashiro's port side at 3:22. Asagumo Tuk was hit by a torpedo at 3:25. Chief Engineer Tokichi Ishii was shaken by an unexpected vibration. To find out what was happening, he called the bridge but got no response. Commander Kazuo Shibayama, the skipper, sent a runner from the bridge a few seconds later to inquire about the port bow's torpedo damage. Torpedoes hit Asagumo at the same moment. Her bows were torn as she quickly absorbed water. After receiving more American torpedoes from McDermott and Monson, the Japanese destroyer suddenly heaved and shuddered violently, slowing to a dead halt. The Japanese now had only 1 battleship, 1 cruiser, and 1 destroyer ready to strike back. All power on the Japanese destroyer went out, and the machinery spaces started flooding quickly. 3 Japanese destroyers and a battleship rendered damaged by a single barrage of torpedoes was a grand slam for the American destroyers that had never been seen in maritime history. Brilliantly conceived and well executed was Oldendorf's direct and precise assessment of the attack. Radio chatter disaster. Japanese battleships ignited and started to founder in the strait. Nishimura attempted to make sense of the quickly developing catastrophe on Yamashiro's flag bridge. Enemy DDs and torpedo boats are stationed at the northern entrance to Surigao Strait, he radioed his superiors. Yamashiro has been struck by 1 torpedo, but her battle integrity is unaffected. 2 of our DDs have been damaged by torpedoes and are drifting. The word reached Tokyo. At 3 in the morning, USS Denver also received the communication. The fact that Nishimura was losing control of the situation was evident from it. It appeared like he thought Fuso was still pursuing him. The Japanese, who were still alive, persisted. Rear Admiral Bond assessed the devastating damage control reports on Fuso's bridge and said, "No, Suso stumbled onto a westerly course about 3:20, 1 powder and shell magazines filling with water. The ship making only 10 knots, her bow drooping into the water, communications out." Shima's troops proceeded to race north at full battle speed behind this site of maritime devastation. Shima listened uneasily to the tactical radio and Japanese voices announcing tragedy on the Nagchi flag bridge. He wondered what was outside as he looked out his windows into the rain and darkness. The task force of Shima struck. Panayon Island was what was out there. His ships were headed in the wrong direction, racing through mist and rain. Lookouts heard waves slamming ashore, saw mountains rising, and yelled warnings at the last minute. Shima avoided calamity and navigational embarrassment by ordering his ships to make a maximum port turn. They were doomed by the enemy at 3:20 when torpedoes burst from the darkness and struck the port side of the light cruiser Abukuma immediately in front of the bridge, tearing open the fragile ship's hull. Water poured in, 1,000 tons. Abukuma and her escorts fired back, but to no effect. Shima had just encountered the American PT boats, who had not yet engaged Nishimura's ships, and they were ready to tear into the Japanese. The ancient cruiser with 37 dead dropped out of formation, as it became evident that Abukuma could not continue. While Abukuma was left to tend to her injuries, the cruiser's escorts ran out into the night. Nishimura's troops proceeded northward. Captain Kenmore McMains' destroyer squadron, 24, Desron 24, which included HMAS Arunta, was the following group of picadors. Her white ensigns were flapping in the breeze. In contrast to previous Sea Dogs, McMains fought this action while crouched over a radar screen in his combat information center, rather than from his flag bridge. Arunta opened up with 5 torpedoes at 3:23 a.m. as McMains got his ships up to 25 knots. A minute later, USS Killen released her fish, all of which were directed at Shigure and Yamashiro. One of Killen's torpedoes struck Yamashiro's port side amidships at 3:31. The battleship slowed to a dangerously sluggish 5 knots and started to list to port. After the dreadnought's holes were mended by determined damage control, Yamashiro returned at a respectable 18 knots. Fuso was in pain south of the flagship, still traveling on a shaky trajectory, most likely attempting to shore on Kanihan Island. However, Chief Engineer Captain Eiichi Nekaya was unable to keep the ship navigable since it was so far down at the bow. Yasuo Kato noticed water pouring in from the hatch above him in number 1 turret. To inform the bridge of his situation, Kato dispatched a message. After giving a salute, the messenger hurried out of the listing turret and returned a short while later. He was unable to move around the deck. It was spewing seawater, oil, and steam. Hideo Ogawa and his friends watched as seawater seeped into their area beneath Kato. Ogawa and 10 of his friends were told to evacuate uphill by the turret captain. To maintain watertight integrity, they closed the steel hatch behind them as they ascended into the projectile room above. After arriving, Ogawa and his shipmates continued climbing and joined 15 other guys who were evacuating through a second steel hoist door. The bridge then issued orders for all number 1 and number 2 turret hands to gather at the center starboard upper deck as backups for damage control. Ship abandoned! Nishimura's shattered ships were still being harassed by McMains and his tin cans of Desron 24. Both enemy and ally pips were all over the radar screens. Asagumo fired torpedoes at USS Daly, which sizzled just under the Americans' bow, but the Japanese retaliated as the Americans maintained the initiative. Fuso's horror was coming to an end, yet the noise and rage in this part of the battle meant nothing because both sides missed one another. Hideo Ogawa saw the forecastle of his ship go under. With her gunhouse dividing the seas with its shield, crewmen fought their way from number 1 turret onto the slanting foredeck. "Complete silence prevailed on our ship," said Yasuo Kato, as he wriggled out of the turret. Then the sharp notes of a bugle blaring, "Abandoned ship," pierced the faint sound of bubbling water and the distant roar of explosions. Kato began diving into the sea with his friends. They heard a grinding clatter when they crossed the Surigao Strait. Fuso's bridge tilted at an angle of 45 degrees to the left and made a terrible noise. It hit the water with a huge splash as everyone glanced skyward. Fuso was listing badly to starboard with her bow buried. She abruptly overturned and corkscrewed to port. After clambering over the starboard rail, Kato ended up standing on the side of the hull and slipping over the blister. Fuso was thrown onto his back into the sea as he spun to port. He swam off. The sea became a sticky, lethal slime that trapped sailors as the ancient warship finally toppled over and sank, releasing dangerous Borneo oil from her tanks. As the oil spread, it made contact with burning debris and ignited other fires. Sailors caught in the goo were killed in the fire, and Ogawa compared the hissing sound produced by the conflagration to roasting beans. Between 3:40 and 3:50 a.m., 15 minutes after being torpedoed, Fusohad sank. She took the majority of her 1,630 man and officer crew to the bottom of the Surigao Strait. Only 10 of the crew of the ancient battleship would make it out alive. At approximately 3:38 a.m., Michishio sank into the strait as Fuso left the scene. Out of her crew, only 4 survived. "This must happen quickly. Hold on to your torpedoes." Amazingly, Shiger, Mogami, and the Bolus Asagumo joined Nishimura as he charged forward with the valor of a samurai. Shima's ships followed suit, trailing Nishimura's by just 4,000 yards. Despite being surrounded by McMains' destroyers, Nishimura persisted in moving northward. The Japanese fired shells at their attackers, who employed smokescreens to great effect. Officers on Mogami's bridge had a hard time interpreting radar screens as they attempted to distinguish between American and Japanese vessels and land formations. Hutchins opened fire on Asagumo, striking her and igniting the Japanese ship's torpedo tubes as the opposing destroyers were now within shooting range. On Louisville, Oldendorf waited for the opportunity to unleash his fury while observing the searchlight beams and explosive flashes. He could tell he was facing 2 battleships, not 4, by listening to the radio talk. West Virginia led the procession of battleships, followed by Maryland, flagship Mississippi, Pennsylvania, Tennessee, and California. The Japanese were now 2,600 yards away from his dreadnoughts. With 9 destroyers moving in 3 sections to corner the enemy, Destroyer Squadron 56, Desron 56, Captain Roland Smoot of USS Newcomb, led the subsequent American assault against Nishimura's force at 3:34 a.m. "This has to be quick," said Captain Thomas Conley, who commanded Smoot's second section, to his destroyers at 3:46. It makes sense that Smoot and Conley were concerned that in this close-quarters conflict, both Japanese fire and American guns might threaten their tin cans. "Stand by your torpedoes." Only a few minutes would pass before the American battleships opened fire on their onslaught. 18 minutes of retaliation. The Japanese continued to close in a disorganized pattern. Radar operators and communicators chanted off steadily diminishing ranges aboard the American dreadnoughts. The range decreased to 15,600 yards at 3:50 a.m. "All right, give the order to open fire," Oldendorf yelled. The Admiral's command was reiterated over sound-powered phones and TBS, talk between ships, radios. Buzzers sounded, gongs rang, and the battle line erupted in a colossal roar of enormous shells, and the deck and bulkheads of the battleships and cruisers shook from the opening salvo, with the exception of Louisville, whose gunners had cut loose before the command was delivered. The heavy cruisers fired their 8-inch guns more slowly, while the light cruisers fired their 6-inch guns quickly. West Virginia started fire in full broadside on Yamashiro, 22,800 yards away. At 3:53 in the morning, her 14-inch gun turrets exploded with replying shells, and her 16-inch guns, 2 of which were manned by men on their maiden sea journey, retaliated for the humiliation she had suffered at Pearl Harbor by striking Yamashiro with the opening salvo. Yamashiro's forecastle swore flame. California opened with the first of 63 rounds of 14-inch shells 2 minutes later. 3 American battleships that had survived Pearl Harbor blasted a single Japanese dreadnought at 3:56, and Tennessee joined the clamor. The American bombardment on Moami flickered in the distance, resembling the sequential activation of light rose on a switchboard in a pitch-black room. The whistle and hiss of incoming shells followed the light show. Massive walls of white water were blasted up by those shells that missed. Although the compass and flag bridge were not hit, the shells that struck Yamashiro struck close to her bridge, rocking the enormous ship, igniting fires, and turning off the radar. Even though Nishimura's T was completely crossed, it made no difference. He was going to expose his number 3 and number 4 turrets, but the magazines for his number 5 and number 6 turrets had been flooded by the earlier blows to his ship, rendering them inoperable. Shigure's main weaponry were her torpedoes, whereas Mogami's wartime reconstructions meant that all of her guns continued to fire. Moreover, hitting head-on targets was more difficult. Nishimura radioed for Fuso to begin fire on the Americans while under fire, not realizing that his second battleship had been sunk. Nishimura also had no idea where Shima was standing behind him. The 2 Japanese troops would be utterly disorganized when they went to battle. At 3:56, HMAS Shropshire finally had a firing solution and fired 32 8-inch broadsides of 8 guns at Yamashiro after American rounds rained down on it. At 3:59 a.m., Maryland detected Yamashiro on her radar and tore her to pieces with her main battery. With only 18 minutes of thundering, the American heavy guns were able to exact revenge for the humiliations of Pearl Harbor and Savo Island, wreaking havoc on Yamashiro. A direct hit destroyed the officer's wardroom, which was used as a sickbay, killing medical lead Lieutenant Buntaro Kitamura and his staff, as well as the wounded they were caring for. Yamashiro's superstructure was torn apart, and her armor torn open by other big shells. Yamamoto, Chief Petty Officer, receives an unexpected promotion. Under intense enemy fire, Mogami maneuvered to port to expose the starboard torpedo tubes as Yamashiro absorbed the shelling and Shigure's fought. The cruiser was not disregarded by the Americans. Under the light of Yamashiro's guns, McMain's destroyers sighted Mogami advancing on the advancing Hutchins. Mogami was fired upon by the destroyers Daly and Botch. In the confusion, Captain Ryo Toma of the cruiser wondered if he was steaming toward American or Japanese ships. Indeed, he flashed a red Very Star and 2 enormous searchlights. His signals were met with a barrage of shells from the Americans. The steel framework of Mogami started to sag after she sustained a hit on her mainmast. Her anti-aircraft mounts and 2 radio rooms were devastated by other shells. Toma made the decision to turn around and attempt to launch torpedoes from his port side. However, Oldendorf's cruisers launched a barrage of 6-inch and 8-inch shells in response to the fire and smoke, which made Mogami's suffering worse. One hit the number 3 turret, rendering it inoperable, and another struck the deck close to the starboard after the engine room's air intake, causing smoke to enter the engine room and forcing the crew to evacuate. Toma and his officers debated whether to continue the attack or to retreat on Mogami's bridge. His officers thought they could still fight their way past the Americans, but Toma wanted to pull out. At 4 in the morning, Mogami turned around and went north after Toma gave in to their Bushido spirit. Nearly every hand at both positions, including Toma, was killed at 4:02 when 2 shells from Portland's destroyed Mogami's compass bridge and a third ripped into the air defense center. Only 4 signalmen, who just so happened to be on the signaling platform, survived. With no one in charge, Mogami was steaming along uncontrollably. The lead was taken by the chief signalman, Chief Petty Officer First Class Shuichi Yamamoto. He discovered that the steering mechanism's power had failed when he dashed onto the destroyed bridge. Using the sound-powered phone, he dialed the armored wheelhouse 2 decks below his feet, requesting manual steering and someone to locate the senior ranking officer. As massive rounds crashed into the cruiser's front number 1 engine room, sending high-pressure steam exploding in all directions and killing trapped engineers, Mogami's, trembling from repeated strikes, swung out of line. Black smoke streamed out, smothering people as the flames moved to the boiler room at number 9. The furnace is turned off by boiler tenders. Mogami had lost 3 engine rooms in a short period of time when another shell switched off all the lights in the port after the engine room at 4:03. In order to give Mogami engine power, the engineers in the port forward engine room disregarded heat and smoke. The gunnery officer, Leiterski MDR Giichiro Arai, was informed he was in command as the trembling cruiser rattled away. He was unable to report to the bridge, however, because the ship's weapons were firing. The Khan would have to stay with Yamamoto. An armada against a single destroyer. The destroyer Shigra sailed on, straddling but unharmed amid all of this shelling and devastation. The gyro compass wasn't working because of all the close calls. Commander Shigeru Nishino, her skipper, called out to the other ships over his radio to ask them where they were or who he should aim at. Nishino calmly summarized the scenario on his bridge: an armada versus 1 destroyer. He stopped his northward advance at 4:03 a.m. and began arcing a starboard reverse spin, leaving the conflict to head south. Fires glowed from the dreadnought's pagoda mast on Yamashiro, resembling the ceremonial lights of Sasebo. The Americans could see Yamashiro's 6-inch turret standing out against the flames' glare because the fires were burning so fiercely. The number 3 turret and its 2 14-inch guns were violently exploded by an American round. 2 aft turrets and the ship's communications were down. The sole bright spot was that the Emperor's image was protected in the conning tower by Paymaster Ensign Yamauchi. Amazingly, Yamashiro persisted. The battleship launched a broadside at the 6 American dreadnoughts after making a wide, leisurely maneuver to reveal her 14-inch guns. In the midst of severe heat, smoke, and fires, Japanese gunners persisted in loading and training turrets. Yamazi fired secondary armament at the bothersome destroyers while alternating shots with her main battery aboard HMAS Shropshire. When the American battle line shifted to starboard at 4:01 a.m., the dreadnoughts rotated 150 degrees and crossed the Surigao Strait to return west. Broadside to broadside, the battleships were traveling in the same direction as Yamashiro and were almost parallel as they turned. Amazingly, As they took their turns, Tennessee and California began to approach each other directly. Tennessee Captain John B. Heffernan issued a series of instructions and, with careful ship management, managed to avert a collision. Captain Henry P. Burnett of California withdrew his dreadnought out of line after seeing what was going on. Due to their inability to obtain radar locks, Mississippi and Pennsylvania never fired a shot, and the 4 battleships that had been firing checked fire. Every ship stops shooting. Oldendorf's cruisers continued to press Yamashiro. Desron 56, commanded by Captain Roland Smoot, rushed in at full speed to fire torpedoes as they exchanged salvos. The American destroyers opened fire at 4,200 yards at 4:04 a.m. In response, the Japanese fired a barrage of 6-inch shells. As they dodged the shells, the Americans brought Albert W. Grant go straight onto Denver's radar. Near hits scattered shrapnel when the American cruiser opened fire on Grant after Denver mistook Grant for the Japanese Shigure, apparently steaming in to unleash torpedoes. Grant's fantail was struck by an American shell, which destroyed the No. 5 5-inch turret. Additional shells were fired from both sides into the port motor whaleboat, the No. 1 40mm gun, the scullery room, the front stack and boiler room, and the forward engine room. They blew out the radios, lights, phones, and radars. Commander Terrell A. Nizawaner, Grant's skipper, responded rapidly. He moved away after launching his 5 torpedoes at the enemy. At the same time, Captain Smoot in Newcomb, witnessing the catastrophe, yelled to Oldendorf over a TBS radio, "You are firing on Com Desron 56. The center of the waterway is where we are." The message reached Oldendorf. He seized the voice radio on the flag bridge in Louisville at 4:09 a.m. and gave the general order, "All ships cease firing." The American ships checked fire, and Newcomb arrived with Grant to tow her injured sister away. On board, anarchy prevailed. Around 4:20 a.m., the ship was dead in the sea, her lifeboats were destroyed, and the engines were gone. It would be necessary to tow her to safety. The final count showed that the destroyer had been hit by at least 11 American cruiser shells and 5 Japanese. There were 28 enlisted soldiers and 6 officers deceased. There were 94 men injured. Nishimura and his ship sink. More hits were scored when the final shells and torpedoes flew at Yamashiro. Around 4:09, one of them, from the unfortunate Grant, smashed the starboard side of the dreadnought, close to the starboard engine room. At 4:09 a.m., the dreadnought slowed down before accelerating once more to 12 knots. "We proceed to Leyte for the main attack," Nishimura instructed his chief of staff to report to Kurita on Yamashiro's flag bridge. "We'll keep going till we're completely destroyed. Without a doubt, I have completed my mission as planned. Don't worry." Now that the firing has stopped, the Surigao Strait is once more dark, with only the fierce fires on Yamashiro, Moami, and Grant for illumination. The Japanese also put out the fire. On the battlefield, silence fell. Admiral Nishimura and the officers and crew of Yamashiro must have regarded this ceasefire as God's gift to the Emperor, according to naval historian Samuel Eliot Morrison. Nishimura made the decision to reassemble and meet Shima's army. Heading southwest, the burning warship began a broad swing to port. Everyone on the American ships looked down at the radar charts, picking out the different blips. The Americans identified Yamashiro as the Japanese dreadnought retreated. The flagship Mississippi unleashed her first and only broadside of the night at Yamashiro, a distance of 19,790 yards, marking the final instance in the history of warfare in which a battleship fired its ordnance at another such vessel. Oldendorf handed the pursuit over to his cruisers and destroyers, directing them to resume fire at 4:19 a.m., with the Japanese seemingly retiring and the American battle line in some disarray. The fattest pip on the American radar displays suddenly disappeared before they could comply. Per the later Naval War College study, Yamashiro seems to have sunk, most likely by capsizing. The War College was correct. Yamashiro was struck by 4 torpedoes, possibly from Newcomb, and the battleship fell down in the ocean, keeling over to port. It heeled over like a crumbling sandcastle, the pagoda superstructure silhouetted in a grotesque hue by fires amidships. Rear Admiral Keitsukiyo Shinoda, the commander, calmly gave the order to leave ship from the bridge. He stayed on his bridge with Nishimura. The burning dreadnought keeled over and capsized in 2 to 5 minutes. Shinoda, Nishimura, his 20-member team, and almost every member of Yamashiro's 1636-member crew descended into the Surigao Strait. Only 2 warrant officers and 8 petty officers returned to Japan, the same number as from Fuso, despite the fact that many sailors survived the sinking. The final torpedo salvo from Japan. At 4:15, the battered cruiser and destroyer headed south, and their lookouts were shocked to see a destroyer racing toward them at 30 knots. Shigure and Mogami were the only remaining vessels of Nishimura's force, and both were withdrawing. Shigure took an 8-inch shell in her fantail, and her skipper logged that he decided to retire. It was Shima's flagship, the Nachi, which began the next stage of the combat behind Shima's lead ship, the Shiranuhi. Hearing and observing gunfire to the north, Shima's ships had made an exciting journey via blazing oil flames and the wreckage of Nishimura's broken vessels. Through smokescreens they moved forward. On the ocean, oil fires raged. At 4:15 a.m., radar detected 2 contacts dead ahead as the ships passed the severely damaged and defenseless Asagumo. "All ships attack," Shima ordered, assuming it was the enemy. Shima's 4 destroyers and 2 cruisers rushed forward, unleashed their long-lance torpedoes, which had wreaked havoc during the arduous battles for Guadalcanal, and uncovered their torpedo batteries. The torpedoes needed to run 8 miles. Oldendorf's flagship, Louisville, was actually their target, but the torpedoes missed. As Shima and his men looked into the cloud and mist to see what had happened, Mogami emerged from the smoke with her No. 3 gun turret in ruins, with burned barrels, a forecastle with holes in it, and flames burning from the flight deck forward. The scoffed-at Mogami was finally retiring, with Chief Petty Officer Yamamoto remaining on the bridge. As the 2 ships neared the range, the crews on the Nachi Holy gave encouraging banzais. Captain Enpei Kanuka assumed that Mogami was dead in the sea and decided to pass her a bit too closely on Nachi's bridge. Everyone was shocked to learn that Mogami was indeed blazing along, just barely, and headed straight toward Nachi. Kanuka yelled, "Complete reversal," then used the right rudder to steer clear of Nachi's sister. It's too late. At 4:23, Mogami's starboard at No. 1 turret and Nachi's anchor deck met, and there was a sickening, startling crunch when the 2 ships struck. The impact destroyed Nachi's No. 2 anti-aircraft mount, tore a 15-meter gash in Nachi's port bow at the waterline, and added more dents to Mogami's already beaten hide. Alarms for flooding sounded, and the 2 vessels separated. Yamamoto sobbed over a megaphone on Mogami's bridge. "This is Mogami! XO and the captain were dead. In-charge gunnery officer. The steering was ruined. Engine-driven steering. Apologies." Exasperated, Shima and Kanuka took the responsibility. Nachi started to plod southward at 5 knots. Mogami fought to get in line behind her 2 sisters. No sound came from the 16 torpedoes that were fired, but everyone listened for explosions. Shima's destroyers attempted to strike, torpedo tubes readied, but her cruisers moved awkwardly. Oldendorf's guns had been silenced by Grant's accident, thus there was no American gunfire to follow. The irate destroyer skippers complied with Shima's order to reverse course to the south and rejoin at 4:35 outside American range. A combative retreat. Shima was evaluating the situation on Nachi. Despite the damage from the crash, his flagship was still capable of 18 knots. However, as demonstrated by the battered Mogami, it was evident that calamity had already taken hold. Shima conferred with his officers. "Admiral, the enemy must be waiting for us with open arms up ahead," observed Kokichi Mori, a torpedo officer, to Shima. "The force of Nishimura is nearly destroyed. We will undoubtedly get caught in a trap. We could pass away at any time." Shima understood that it would be unwise to proceed at this time. It's time to leave. Through his binoculars, Oldendorf examined the smoke, oil fires, and quiet in Louisville before directing a cautious pursuit of his defeated adversary. There might be up to 3 battleships, 5 cruisers, and 6 to 8 destroyers beyond the smoke, according to information. But he had no idea if there were more enemy ships out there, waiting to surprise him with shells and long-lance torpedoes. And the ammo on his battle line was running low. Louisville, Portland, Minneapolis, Denver, and Columbia started their journey south at 4:37 a.m. Shima gave the order for his ships to follow, behind Nachi at 4:41. They were withdrawing slowly, stumbling along at 20 knots. Ammunition began to cook off on the damaged Moami, posing a threat to the crew and impeding repairs. 4 of the torpedoes that Arai had ordered his troops to drop exploded, adding to the already simmering fires. Amazingly, the engines continued to run, and Arai maneuvered his ship using hand steering. The fight continued to splutter. The PT boats that had not used their torpedoes earlier in the battle encountered the retreating Japanese ships. 3 PT boats from Lieutenant Carl T. Gleason's Section 11 launched an attack on the destroyers Shigure and Asagumo. Although the Japanese fire was erratic and off course, 1 American torpedo exploded too soon. The Japanese used the flaming fish as a target and fired 5-inch shells at the PT boats after another slithered out of its tube on PT 326 and clattered to the deck, a faulty, hot run. Before the flaming torpedo could be rolled overboard, 1 guy was wounded by shrapnel. The Japanese ships kept moving away, now joining the Abukuma, which had fixed its damage and was prepared to strike. Shima was pleased to add another escort to his damaged army, but he turned down the offer. Oldendorf's search was abandoned. Louisville was 8 miles west of Esconchada Point, the scene of the collision between Nachi and Mogamihad an hour earlier at 5:20 a.m. Oldendorf instructed his column to turn right and be ready to shell the escaping Japanese with full broadsides after examining the scenario via his binoculars. At 5:29, the Americans fired further shells at the Mogami, resulting in multiple direct hits as the open fire gongs rang. Nevertheless, the cruiser managed to withstand this most recent barrage, reaching speeds of 14 knots. In Asagumo, further American shells descended from Minneapolis, igniting a fire and exposing her oil tanks. The warship was burning, its torpedoes spreading and threatening, barely able to achieve 7 knots. Commander Kazuo Shibayama, the Asagumo's skipper, gave the order for his crew to leave the ship at 6 in the morning. At 5:39 a.m., Oldendorf stopped the fire and turned back north, fearing Japanese torpedoes. In order to find survivors of the 2 battleships and 2 destroyers lost in the Surigao Strait, the American destroyers now started probing the wreckage in the early morning. "Do not overload your ships with survivors," Oldendorf commanded his ships. "Examine each individual thoroughly to make sure he is unarmed. Shoot anyone who is resisting. Proceed on your own to collect survivors." After more run-ins with PT boats, Shima's exhausted fleet was now leaving the Surigao Strait and entering the Mindanao Sea. First up was PT 491, which fired torpedoes at Mogami. Mogami retaliated with 8-inch shells, and PT 491 withdrew. Japanese survivors who had rejected American pleas to surrender were gathered in the debris-strewn waters of the Surigao Strait as American destroyers steadily steamed into the area. PT 323 launched a torpedo into the motionless tin can, flinging troops on her weather decks into the water, as other ships chased the disabled Asagumo, whose bows had been ripped apart. Oldendorf dispatched 6 destroyers and the cruisers Denver and Columbia to polish off Asagumo after learning of this target. Oldendorf's superiors at 7th Fleet were starting to send him desperate messages. Kurita's battleships had raced through the open San Bernardino Strait and were advancing on the ill-prepared escort carriers off Samar. Despite his lack of ammunition, Oldendorf had to speed to the rescue because the fox was among the hens. One thing had been accomplished by Nishimura. He had managed to divert Kincaid's heavy warships so that they could use their energy and ammunition to repel the onslaught from the south rather than Kurita's thrust from the north. Attacked from above, Shima's retreating ships, on their way home early in the morning, waited for the one thing that was certain to happen that day: an American airstrike. When Shima radioed for fighter cover, the escort carrier USS Asante deployed 9 Grumman TBF Avenger torpedo bombers and 4 Grumman F-6F Hellcat fighters, while USS Sangamon launched 2 Avengers and 6 Hellcats at 5:45 a.m. They attacked Shima's shattered ships, misreporting them as 2 battleships. That was common. Airmen perceived Japanese heavy cruisers as battleships due of their enormous superstructures. The Americans launched an assault. Strafing killed 9 Shiranuhi and wounded 25 more, while the unlucky Moami was hit by another torpedo. The blazing Moami was then stormed by 10 Avengers and 5 Grumman FM-2 Wildcats from USS Omni Bay's VC-75, which scored 2 additional hits, ignited fires, and brought the ship to a stop. The cruiser was sprayed with hoses by the destroyer Akebono. The fires were tackled by everyone, save the anti-aircraft crews. The cruiser's oil tanks caught fire after the American bombs crashed into them. To avoid an explosion, acting commander and gunnery officer Arai ordered the 3 forward 8-inch magazines to be flooded. However, the valves for the No. 1 gunroom would not open due to the warped bulkheads. The cruiser was on fire and might capsize at any time. At 10:30 a.m., a tearful Arai gave the order for his soldiers to leave the ship. Akebono restricted Mogami's port quarter to the crew of the cruiser because she was unable to utilize her cutter due to broken davits. 13. Curtiss SB-2C Helldiver dive bombers, which strafed the Japanese ships and punched holes in the destroyer Ushio, were Shima's final attack of the day at 9:33 a.m. After 3 hours of frantic firefighting, the weary crew of Mogami managed to climb up on the weather decks and evacuate the ship, scurrying onto Akebono. An explosion in No. 1 magazine accelerated the cruiser's downfall when Akebono fired a long lance into the port side of the Mogami at 12:56. At 1:07, Mogami disappeared under the waters while her crew watched and wept on Akebono. Akebono saved all 850 members of Mogami's crew, with the exception of 20 officers, 171 enlisted men, and 1 civilian. Shima received additional bad news at 1:33 when Kurita informed him that the main force was retiring after failing in its mission and was abandoning its planned attack on the Leyte anchorage. Although Shima's response is not captured on camera, he kept backing away, going for Japan for ultimate safety in Brunei. However, Nishino, her skipper, was relieved of command at the end of the month after she readied up at Sasebo on November 14th after being accused of lacking aggression in the Surigao Strait. The fallout persisted. On October 26th, 1 day later, the U.S. The 33rd Squadron's Army Air Force's consolidated B-24 Liberators pounded her. 3 B-24s were shot down by Japanese anti-aircraft gunners, but torpedoes were ignited as flames spread throughout Abukuma's decks. Captain Takuo Hanada, her skipper, gave the order to abandon the ship. Of her 438-man crew, he, 25 officers, and 257 enlisted men made it out alive. One of history's most one-sided naval actions. It was easy enough what had happened. In one of the most lopsided naval engagements in history, Nishimura and Shima had sailed into a barrage of gunfire and lost. There were thousands of them, including Nishimura, but the Japanese were unable to count their dead. The action claimed the lives of 3 destroyers, 2 battleships, and a heavy cruiser. Shortly after, the light cruiser Abukumawas was also sunk. Exactly 39 Americans were killed and 114 injured, the majority of whom were on Albert W., due to a lone PT boat and friendly fire. More significantly, the Japanese plan to use a double pincer approach to destroy the American invasion fleet had utterly failed in the south. Vice Admiral Halsey's contentious choice to leave the San Bernardino Strait unguarded was largely responsible for the northern pincer's near defeat of a far weaker American force off Samar. However, Oldendorf had crushed the southern pincer with his cool, careful strategy and brave warriors. It was even simpler to determine why the Japanese attack was unsuccessful. As they had done throughout the conflict, the Japanese overestimated their own commitment and underestimated American might and tenacity. When faced with American technology and resolve, Bushido Code proved insufficient. Compared to the spectacular standards of 1942, Japanese gunnery and torpedo efficiency were significantly less effective. The collision between Nachi and Moami demonstrated that even Japanese seamanship was flawed. In addition to failing to coordinate their forces, Nishimura and Shima appeared to be unaware of the whereabouts of their own ships. Shima's withdrawal was arguably the most astute Japanese move of the entire conflict. The Japanese who survived placed the blame on Nishimura, their late boss. According to survivors, Nishimura's approach was more akin to that of a warrant officer than an admiral, according to Hiroshi Tanaka of Yamashiro. However, it was hard to imagine what more Nishimura might have done. He gave precise orders: butcher the American transports, punch past the American defenses, and steam into the Strait of Surigao. With all of his strength and every ship under his command, he had attempted to do so, and he had paid the price with his own life. Nishimura and his sailors tried their utmost to obey their commands with full and hopeless courage, even though the cause itself was hopeless. The battle line era's end. Additionally, it marked the end of a military strategy that began in 1655, when the Dutch Admiral Obdam was vanquished by the British Duke of York at the Battle of Lowestoft. The battle line. From the period of sail until the age of steam, it had been translated. The rise of air power, the violent night surface engagements of Guadalcanal, and the unsporting but lethal submarine had now rendered the battle line obsolete. The devastating potential of atomic weapons and guided missiles was still to come. As the morning rose above the oil flames, fuming muzzles, and smoldering debris in the Surigao Strait, the triumphant American sailors most likely did not think such thoughts. On board Louisville, Oldendorf evaluated Seymour's frantic communications and gave his officers the order to begin arranging formations and courses to support the escort carriers who were in danger. The youthful sailors aboard the American warships were amazed that nothing had happened to them throughout a night of ferocity. To welcome the new day, they were all still alive. "Hear this!" the loudspeakers roared. "Safe from the public areas. Put torpedo defense on standby.